Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Edge of Eternities, which is the next set that drops on Arena. I believe it comes out next Tuesday, and it's going to be exclusively talking about Timeless for this video, which is, it's the format I'm most excited to play once it comes out, because there's so many crazy cards getting added to the format, especially unrestricted strip mines, so I think this is going to be the biggest shake-up to the format, maybe since the release of Modern Horizons 3. It's going to be sick, so I'm really excited for it. I've also already had a premium article for MTG Zone come out, which has some Theorycraft deck lists, so if you're interested in seeing ideas that I've come up with to try out for day one of the release, I'll have a link to that down in the description as well. And then I'm also going to be talking about Historic over the next couple of days as well, so I'll have a premium article coming out tomorrow that has Historic Theorycraft deck lists, just if you're after ideas for stuff to try out once the set comes out. And then on Monday, day before the set release comes out, I'm also going to be doing a similar set review video for Historic as well, because there's still a bunch of cards for Historic I'm really excited for, especially Eldrazi Temple. That seems like it's going to be a pretty crazy addition to the format, but we'll get to that in the Historic video. So anyway, let's just get straight into it. So Strip Mine is coming to the format, and initially at least it's going to be a 4 of, which is insane to me, right? I don't think it's been available as a 4 of in any format since Vintage, which was, I think, banned in like the late 90s. So this is going to be an absolutely huge shake-up to the format. So I've not actually played with Strip Mine or even Wasteland. Like, I'm not a Legacy player or anything like that. So I've not seen firsthand what these sorts of cards can do, but I can have a guess, right? This is basically Wasteland that's much more difficult to play around. Obviously, we do have some ways to play around it, like, you got Stifle and Fetch lands and stuff like that. But the fact that this can destroy basics means you can't just fetch basics to play around it. This is just going to have such a big impact on the format. And, we're going to talk about all the different ways it's going to change things. So first of all, I think one of the biggest impacts is any deck that relies on lands as part of its proactive game plan is going to take a massive hit while Strip Mine's at a 4 of. Now, I don't think there are that many decks that are using them right now. Shifting woodland decks, for example, haven't really been a big thing in Timeless for a long time now. So, but if you're building a deck around these sorts of lands, absolutely the wrong time to be doing it. Secondly, I think another card that's going to get hit quite a lot by Strip Mine is Ugin's Labyrinth, which is kind of a weird one because I do think the addition of some of the other lands that we're going to get that I'm going to talk about later, like Ancient Tomb and Eldrazi Temple, kind of incentivize you to play Ugin's Labyrinth a little bit more because, Ancient Tomb and Eldrazi Temple by extension incentivizes you to be playing, a lot of 2 and 4 drops, a lot of Eldrazi to make sure you're getting ramp off it. So if you're running cards like Chalice of the Void, Mind Stone, Solar Transformer, sideboard cards like Torpor Orb and Disruptive Flute, you do want a high density of ways to get to 2 mana on turn 1. And also if you're running Eldrazi Temple, a lot of the best imprintable cards for Ugin's Labyrinth are Eldrazi as well. So I do think Ugin's Labyrinth is going to see an increase in play, but it's very, very risky to do with Strip Mine, because if you go, Ugin's Labyrinth imprint turn 1 and the opponent Strip Mines that and you've tapped out that land and you can't put the imprintable card back in your hand, not only are you getting cut off mana, you're getting cut off 2 mana and you're losing the imprintable card as well. So Ugin's Labyrinth I do think is going to be worth playing, especially in Eldrazi lists. If you're running Eldrazi Temple, if you're running Ancient Tomb and Strip Mine as well, but it's going to be super risky as well. Then other cards that I think are going to get a lot better, just snowbally 1-drops, especially Ragavan is going to be huge because, Strip Mine obviously can be used, just to cut the opponent off their proactive game plan, but it can also be used as a really good tempo play. If you go Ragavan on turn 1 and then just start strip mining the opponent's lands, you're going to be pulling ahead so quickly, both in terms of mana because of the treasure and card advantage as well. Then other cards that I think are going to get really big buffs by it is, well, first of all, Sowing Mycospawn I think is really, really well positioned right now because of Ancient Tomb, Eldrazi Temple, and Strip Mine as well, because not only does this get accelerated into by all of those cards, so you're going to be able to cast it on turn 2, turn 3 very, very consistently. The fact it tutors Strip Mine into play untapped so that you can fire it off straight away is absolutely huge as well. Then in terms of other ways to tutor for it, I think one of the big differences of having Strip Mine straight away as a 4 of is that you don't really need to go too hard into ways to specifically tutor it. So, cards like White of the Reliquary, Sylvan Scrying, other ways to tutor it, doesn't really seem worth it right now to me as a 4 of, especially when we already have cards like Once Upon a Time that I think are going to be worth playing. If you're running green for cards like Sowing Mycospawn, Once Upon a Time seems like such a good way to increase consistency of not only, finding the Strip Mine to begin with for matchups where it's good, but, finding Ugin's Labyrinth, finding your Ancient Tomb, finding your Eldrazi Temple to ensure that you can cast your Sowing Mycospawns early and stuff like that. So I think White of the Reliquary and, other cards that aren't as generically powerful as a Sowing Mica Spawn, probably aren't going to be worth running until Strip Mine gets restricted, at which point you can maybe build like a deck where you run Green Sun Zenith, which is another card that we're getting alongside White of the Reliquary and Raminap Excavator, maybe the new Ice Till Explorer, so that you can set up, you know, Strip Mine loops. But right now, with Strip Mine as a 4 of, I really don't think it's worth running cards that aren't generically powerful like Sowing Mica Spawn. You know, these are maybe worth looking at in future though. Then additionally, we've also got cards that allow you to loop it from the graveyard. You've got Crucible of Worlds, you've got Walk-in Closet, which is basically Crucible of Worlds, slightly more difficult to cast, but it also has another mana sink. Raminap Excavator, which is obviously on a creature body, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. And then we're also getting a new card from this set as well, Ice Till Explorer, which is a pretty interesting one, which is a Crucible of Worlds that also allows you to play an additional land each turn, and this seems like it would be, you know, the Strip Mine Mirror Breaker, right? If you can get one of these down and you're strip mining the opponent twice a turn, that's pretty crazy, but 4 mana is a lot. And I think one of the other knock-on effects of having Strip Mine in the format is that it is going to make more expensive cards a lot more difficult to cast consistently, so I'm skeptical about this one just because of the 4 mana cost. But if you can consistently get it out and the format does sort of, you know, slow down and revolve around Strip Mine Mirrors, this is one to consider. But again, I'm skeptical about, you know, 4 mana cards, especially when Strip Mine is going to be causing a lot of mana denial. But anyway, about these cards, I mean, generically they're not that good, but you know, if you're using these to just loot Strip Mine, they don't really do much without Strip Mine. But if Strip Mine does dominate the format like I think it will, these then become a lot more interesting, because if you can get these down early, it kind of counteracts the opponent's Strip Mines, right? Because the idea of Strip Mine is eventually, you know, the opponent will miss land drops and then they'll just be stuck on 1 or 2 mana for the whole game. Whereas with Crucible of Worlds, if the opponent keeps Strip Mining you, you're not really falling too far behind unless the opponent has something like an Ice Till Explorer. So getting Crucible of Worlds down early, especially in a format with fetch lands and, you know, Strip Mine, and I also think Strip Mine is probably going to incentivize people to play more fetch lands because it's the way that you can play around it. So I'm not sure about these cards. It's really difficult to evaluate, because the other big downside of these is that pretty much all awful in multiples, with maybe the exception of Raminap Excavator. Obviously Ice Till Explorer is a different case because that's way more expensive, but you know, if you are going to be running these in the main deck, how many can you get away with? I wouldn't personally be comfortable even with like Walk-in Closet, which has another mana sink, of running it as more than a 1 or 2 of. So I'm really not sure about these cards. Maybe it's correct to run these as a 1 or 2 of, but personally, I think, well, the way I'm going to be building it initially, because these are situational, they are 3 mana as well, so they're not super easy to cast early on unless you're running a lot of acceleration, is I think just running 4 Strip Mine, and then I think a lot of decks might be more interested in running Khan the Great Creator now, with, you know, Ancient Tomb and stuff allowing us to accelerate into it more quickly there. And then if you're running Khan, you can just tutor for Crucible of Worlds out the sideboard in situations where it's good, rather than having to run it in the main deck where it can be awkward in certain situations. But I don't know, I'm having a hard time evaluating these, because I can see them being good, you know, especially as a defensive mechanism against opposing Strip Mines, but you know, it's a pretty situational card, and yeah, it is just bad to run in multiples, which is the big sticking point for me. Then in terms of other cards that get a lot better because of Strip Mines in the format, I think non-land sources of mana are going to be huge, especially Deathrite Shaman. I think Deathrite Shaman is probably going to be the card that increases in importance the most with Strip Mine in the format, because, you know, not only does this provide you with a way to, you know, fix mana and give you consistent mana source if the opponent is cutting you off lands, but Strip Mine, fetch lands also fuel it way more easily now as well. You know, when I used to build Deathrite Shaman decks back, you know, at the start of the format, I would always try and get, you know, 10, 12 fetch lands. But now, if everyone's running fetch lands, if everyone's running Strip Mine to cut you off your lands, and Strip Mine goes to the graveyard as well, Deathrite Shaman is going to be way easier to fuel. And as I mentioned, if people do start running ways to recur the Strip Mine, Deathrite Shaman can cut that off by exiling Strip Mine from the graveyard as well, which is huge. So Deathrite Shaman I expect to be a really big card. I'm going to be trying to run it in as many decks as possible. Additionally, Chromox. I mean, Chromox is already one of the best cards in the format anyway, but this is going to be another card that increases in importance, I think, because, you know, immune to Strip Mine, another mana source, and then additionally, we've got some other more situational cards that certain decks can run. So if you are running Ugin's Labyrinth, Ancient Tomb, and stuff like that, you got cards like Mind Stone and Solar Transformer. Now, when I was theory crafting deck lists for this format, or, you know, for Timeless after the set comes out, I think Solar Transformer is probably going to be the more desirable one especially if you're running Ugin's Labyrinth, because if you think about your mana base, right, you're going to be running 4 Strip Mine, 4 Ancient Tomb, 4 Eldrazi Temple, 4 Ugin's Labyrinth. That's a lot of your mana base just for colourless lands, and presumably you're going to want coloured lands, especially for stuff like Sowing Mica Spawns. So the fact that Solar Transformer can fix your mana as well is absolutely huge. But, you know, this is another way that we can kind of play around Strip Mine a little bit, right? If you go Ancient Tomb into Solar Transformer and the opponent Strip Mines your Ancient Tomb, you've still got a mana source in play, which is a big deal. And then obviously you could run Mox Amber in decks like Affinity, or, you know, maybe an Izzet deck running both Ragavan and Tamiyo as ways to kind of snowball the game early on. Could benefit from Mox Amber as well, so that's another one. And then in terms of other effects that also are good kind of against Strip Mine, we've got Stifle, which is another card that I think is going to get quite a bit better as well. You know, Stifle typically, you would use it to obviously counter the opponent's fetch lands, and then usually use something proactive within your own deck, whether that's countering the One Ring trigger or stifling your Uro or whatever the case. Now, I'm not sure Uro is really going to be that desirable in the current format when there's going to be a ton of colorless lands and you need green, green, blue, blue to escape it and stuff like that. But Stifle right now, I'm not even sure that you would need to run something for your proactive game plan, really. You know, typically in the past, I'm not a big fan of just running Stifle to go for fetch lands, but if everyone's running fetch lands and if everyone's running Strip Mine, this seems like it could just be generically powerful enough, because you can counter Strip Mine, counter fetch lands, and then you're kind of doubling up on the mana denial plan, right? If you're running both Strip Mine and Stifle, that's going to be a nightmare for the opponent. And additionally, I think a way that people can play around Strip Mine in the format, if they are running a lot of fetch lands, is, you know, say they have say they have a 2 or 3 drop in their hand that they really need to be able to cast. You know, say they're playing Psychic Frog and they really need to cast it on turn 2. If the opponent has 2 fetch lands, they can just run out of fetch land and just not crack it, so the opponent doesn't have an opportunity to use Strip Mine, and then wait until turn 2 to crack their fetches. But if people are waiting to crack their fetches to play around Strip Mine, that then plays more into Stifle, right? It gives you an opportunity to draw Stifle off the top and still use it if the opponent is holding off on, you know, cracking their fetches early on. So I think Stifle is going to be another card that is definitely going to get better with the addition of Strip Mine. And then we've also got Blood Moon as well, which, you know, the addition of Ancient Tomb to the format and also Magus of the Moon that I'm going to talk about in a little bit to give redundancy for this sort of effect is really huge, because getting Blood Moon down, obviously it does cut you off your ability to use your own Strip Mines as well, but, you know, this incidentally punishes multicolored decks and also shuts off all of the opponent's, you know, Strip Mine shenanigans if they are built around stuff like Ice Till Explorer to try and loop it. Shuts off all of that. Not to mention the other cards that we're getting in the format, Ancient Tomb, Eldrazi Temple, which then incentivizes Ugin's Labyrinth as well. Blood Moon just shuts off all of that stuff as well. Makes it really difficult for the Eldrazi decks to ramp. So, which I think Eldrazi is definitely going to increase in popularity because of Eldrazi Temple, Ancient Tomb and stuff like that. So I'm definitely interested in trying out, you know, some Stompy or just, you know, faster red decks to try and lock the opponent out the game, you know, kind of like Mono Red Prison. And then next up, as I mentioned a few times, we're getting Ancient Tomb in the format, which I'm so excited about. I've really wanted this card in Timeless for a long time now, and we're finally getting it. Unfortunately, we don't get City of Traitors, which does, you know, limit the amount of acceleration that, like I said, a mono red prison deck could run, but still super happy to get Ancient Tomb. And this is another card that's going to have a big impact on the format. So obviously getting 2 colorless mana on turn 1 is really powerful, because there's a lot of, you know, powerful 2-drops that getting down early is a huge deal, especially Chalice of the Void. This is going to be absolutely huge, because it has felt like quite a long time in Timeless that it is, you know, Mardu versus, you know, energy versus combo decks, and Chalice of the Void on X=1 is going to be super good against the energy decks. It's going to be really strong against, you know, the tempo decks that rely on a lot of 1-mana interaction. Not to mention, you know, there are still some Dark Ritual combo decks as well. You know, Underworld Breach and stuff like that is going to get completely shut down by Chalice on 1. So this is going to have a really big impact on the format, where it could, you know, if a lot of decks are running Chalice on, Chalice on 1, then that could be a hit to energy. Now, having said that, there are a few cards that they can run to kind of counteract that. So I think Prismatic Ending is a pretty big one, you know, because they can just make it so that it doesn't cost 1 technically to remove this. So I think, you know, this isn't going to be enough on its own to push energy out of the format, especially if they adapt. But this is definitely going to be a big player in the format, and it is going to be a problem for energy, especially game one if they don't adapt to it. Then obviously, as I said earlier, we've got other acceleration, Mind Stone, Solar Transformer, that is going to be really important for the sort of Eldrazi decks, I think, especially the Ugin's Labyrinth ones that might want to eventually get to casting their big 7+ cards. And then we've got a few sideboard cards that are really going to benefit from being able to get 2 colorless mana on turn 1. You've got Disruptive Flute, which is obviously going to be good against, you know, your Sorins, your Charbelchers, and potentially Show and Tell as well. And then Torpor Orb as well, you know, not as important right now, but, you know, is a good sideboard card against decks like Energy. And also, if you are running Eldrazi, it's also nice with Null Drifter as well, so some nice crossover there. Then another thing that I think is, well, another section of cards that are going to really benefit from Ancient Tomb is any 3-drop that has 2 colorless mana in its casting cost. So obviously the biggest one for Timeless is going to be Show and Tell, which is kind of scary, right? You know, it's awesome to get a big shake up like this, but one of the new cards is also incidentally a pretty big buff to Show and Tell. That's always going to be pretty scary. So we'll have to see where, I mean, obviously Ancient Tomb is going to be a slam dunk for in Show and Tell, but we'll have to see how Show and Tell adapts in the new meta, because it does feel like a lot of the new decks I've been theory crafting, Eldrazi, Mono Red Prison and stuff like that, seems well positioned against a lot of the format, but both of those seem like they'd struggle against Show and Tell. Obviously there are a number of sideboard cards you can bring in against them, so you could just sideboard more heavily against it, but yeah, we'll have to see how it ends, because I could just see Show and Tell becoming the best deck. We'll have to see how it pans out. Then, as I mentioned a minute ago, we've got Blood Moon as well, and also Magus of the Moon, which kind of gives us redundancy for this sort of effect, which I think is a really big deal for the Mono Red Prison decks. I think those sorts of decks will probably be wanting to run 7 or 8 of this sort of effect, because, you know, especially these sorts of cards are going to be phenomenal against the Eldrazi decks. Now, which of these is going to be better, I think largely depends on just the interactive suite that's being run right now. Obviously, Magus of the Moon, the big weakness of this is that if the opponent's running red base removal, Lightning Bolt, Unholy Heat, whatever the case, then it's going to be a lot easier to kill. And also, I think Dismember is kind of a good catch-all answer against Magus, especially from those Eldrazi decks that most of their lands are going to be colorless, so it's going to be difficult to run colored removal. Dismember is a great answer to that, and to Magus of the Moon as well. So if a lot of the Eldrazi lists are sideboarding Dismember, I imagine Blood Moon is probably the better choice. But again, you know, people are used to playing around Blood Moon in Timeless right now. You know, there's a lot of cards people can run. Boseiju, Force of Vigor. So I think the prison decks are probably going to be interested in running the full 8 of these, and I think they are going to be relatively well positioned right now. Although, like I said, I am a little bit worried about Show and Tell because they can fetch around it fairly easily. And then another card that I do think is interesting with Ancient Tomb is Sorin. Now, it's kind of weird because Sorin is obviously a Dark Ritual card, and Dark Ritual decks typically want to be running Necropotence and sometimes Necro Dominance, which don't really pair very well with Ancient Tomb, but I think you could potentially run Dark Ritual decks without those cards and run Sorin with Ancient Tomb, which could be interesting, but I'm not 100% sure the best way to build that yet. And then obviously you've got colorless 3-drops that you can accelerate into with Ancient Tomb as well, that can also be played off other colorless lands. Again, we don't really have too many great ones right now. Crucible of Worlds is probably the most notable one. And then obviously we've got the 4-mana colorless cards, the One Ring and Calm, that, you know, you can play these on turn 2 off combination of 2 Ancient Tombs, you know, Ancient Tomb and Ugin's Labyrinth or whatnot. So this card is going to be a really big deal. It is kind of interesting that we get good counterplay to it in Strip Mine in the same set. Kind of interesting there, but yeah, I expect Ancient Tomb to be a really big change to the format for sure. Then next up we got Eldrazi Temple, which is the 3rd big land we're getting in the format, and while this is obviously way more narrow than Ancient Tomb, the big thing here is just redundancy. Now we have Ancient Tomb, Ugin's Labyrinth and Eldrazi Temple as 12 lands in the deck that can really accelerate you, that are difficult to interact with if the opponent doesn't have Strip Mine. Now obviously, you know, we don't really have any playable 2-mana Eldrazi apart from the one that discounts your 7+ mana ones, which is kind of unplayable in Timeless, I think. But we do have some really powerful cards that Eldrazi Temple accelerating into is huge. First of which, obviously, as I mentioned a few times, Sowing Micah Spawn. This card is going to be the centerpiece of these Eldrazi decks. Works so well with Strip Mine. Great mana sink later in the game as well. So this is an excellent payoff for Eldrazi Temple, as is Kozilek's Command. I think this is one of the best cards from Modern Horizons 3, already playable in Timeless in terms of power level, and now getting Ancient Tomb, getting Eldrazi Temple, this card is going to be even more, but you know, even more consistent, even faster. Really excited about it. Now, in my theory craft builds that I've been working on, I have been running a lot of decks that are running Eldrazi Temple and not running Ugin's Labyrinth, because, you know, I think Ugin's Labyrinth is definitely a risk with Strip Mine in the format. But I've been running lists that only have these two as payoffs for Eldrazi Temple. Now, obviously, in those lists, the 4 Eldrazi Temple is fine. I can deal with these 4 cards being just colorless mana sources in a lot of games if we don't draw these two. But let me know in the comments if you think just running 8 cards is enough to justify running 4 Eldrazi Temple in the mana base, because I kind of think it could be, but I've not actually played with Eldrazi Temple myself. Players who are more experienced with it, definitely let me know in the comments. Now, having said that, there are a few other cards that I could see being worth playing. You know, the cheaper ones, or the main cheap ones that stand out to me are Thought Not Seer, which provides some hand interaction, which is very important in Timeless, and Glaring Flesh Raker, which is a very powerful card if you build around it. But I don't know, these kind of cards just seem like they might be too slow for Timeless. I think, you know, the main cards I'm interested in off Eldrazi Temple are Sown Mycospawn Spawn, which can just tutor for Strip Mine straight away, cut the opponent off mana, and Kozilek's Command, which has a big impact on the game. These cards kind of feel like just like the middle ground where they don't imprint to Ugin's Labyrinth, so they don't provide those really fast starts, but they also just don't really close the game out very quickly. You know, Timeless just feels a little bit too fast for these sorts of cards, so I could see them being good, but I'm not super optimistic about it. Now, having said that, we do have a number of Eldrazi that are good to imprint to Ugin's Labyrinth. Null Drifter is obviously the best one because it's castable early, and the fact that we can invoke this on turn 2 using Eldrazi Temple is a pretty big deal as well. Obviously, we've got Devourer of Destiny, which kind of, you know, helps enable those super busted starts, getting you to your, you know, your Ancient Tombs, your imprinted Ugin's Labyrinth more consistently, which is a pretty big deal. And obviously, Eldrazi Temple can help hardcast these in the mid game, which, you know, can happen in a lot of Timeless games. Another card I've been interested in recently, or in my theory crafts anyway, is Void Winnower, which is, you know, 9 mana is a lot. I very much doubt you're ever really going to hardcast this unless the game goes on for a really long time. But the interesting thing about this card is it can imprint to Ugin's Labyrinth, and it does something against Show and Tell, right? It doesn't look the game out as effectively as more targeted cards, but it does stop them doing a lot of, you know, specific things. So, and I've also been thinking, you know, Eldrazi does seem like a generically powerful list, but it does seem like it will struggle against Show and Tell, especially game 1. So if you're looking for imprintable cards to Ugin's Labyrinth and you're worried about Show and Tell, this could be an interesting option there for sure. I've not tested it out myself yet though, so not sure how effective it is, but it does shut off a lot of their important cards. And like I said, you don't have great options game 1 to help there really. And then obviously you've got stuff like Worldbreaker, which can help as well. So Eldrazi Temple, whilst it is definitely the least exciting of the 3, just having redundancy for acceleration in an Eldrazi deck is going to be a really big deal. One other land as well, I guess, you know, another fairly important land, but one that does have more restrictions, Gemstone Caverns, which does provide acceleration if you're on the draw. Now, obviously, the big downside of this is it's legendary, so running it as more than a 1 or 2 of can cause you issues. It's a colorless land if you don't have it in your opening hand or you're on the play, and you have to exile cards to get it in early. So there are way more restrictions on this compared to the other 3 lands that we've looked at. But I definitely see, you know, a world where certain decks would be interested in this, especially if they really just want to accelerate and they can deal with the colorless mana cost. So yeah, we'll have to see. I can't really think of too many decks off the top of my head that would want this straight away, but this definitely seems like a card that I'm going to be brewing with. And, you know, I'm super excited for this one in Historic as well, where we don't have as much acceleration, but I'll get onto that in Monday's set review video. Then next up, another card that I'm really excited for, mainly in Historic, but I do think this card can have a big impact a relatively big impact in Timeless, is Tezzeret Cruel Captain, which I'm mainly excited for in the Affinity deck. Now, it is kind of interesting, you know, this can tutor for a lot of hate cards against established decks, and you can, you know, cast it off Dark Ritual on turn 1, but I really think for this to be good in Timeless, you need to be running a deck with a lot of artifact synergies to just naturally hit the passive, tick it up so that we can either get multiple, you know, tutor cards, or potentially hit the -7, which is, you know, a pretty powerful effect. But I think the main things we're interested in here are the ability to tutor 4 hate pieces, and then the ability to, you know, tick it up and then tutor again. Obviously, the untap ability is pretty nice, especially if we have either artifact-based mana sources like Chrome Mox or Mox Amber, or the One Ring as well. Untapping the One Ring is pretty interesting on this, and obviously you can untap creatures to give it kind of pseudo-vigilance as well. But like I said, the main thing we're interested in here is the -3 ability to start tutoring stuff to shut off the opponent's proactive game plan. And we do have some pretty interesting options. Tormod's Crypt is a nice one that we can shoot at and get into play immediately, which puts a loyalty counter on it and shuts the opponent off any graveyard synergies. We can use it to accelerate. We can grab Chromox or Mox Amber to just, accelerate that turn. And then obviously if we've got it in play, we can untap on future turns. There's another way to accelerate. We can shoot a creature removal. Aether Spellbomb, obviously not as effective against smaller creatures, but if the opponent's cheating bigger creatures like Atraxa or whatever into play, having Spellbomb as a way to just bounce it for pretty cheap is nice. And I imagine, like I said, the best home for this is probably going to be Mono Blue Affinity, so you can use the blue ability freely there. Vexing Bauble, whilst is bypassable by Show and Tell via Veil of Summer and Abrupt Decay, still useful to be able to tutor for, especially game one where they might not have those cards in very high numbers, if at all, in the main deck. So that's a nice one for Show and Tell. Pithing Needle as well, you can shut off Sorin, can shut off Goblin Charbelcher, as well as a number of other cards. And then also the Timeless Affinity lists that I've seen don't tend to run Retrofit Foundry or Ornithopter, but I think if you're running Tezzeret, these cards become quite a bit better because they're very good at just incidentally putting loyalty counters on it, and they work, they're both tutorable with Tezzeret as well. So, if you go Retrofit Foundry on turn 1 and then Tezzeret on turn 2, you can just tutor for Ornithopter, which is a way to protect the Tezzeret, which is especially useful against creature decks like Energy. Then you can chump block with the Ornithopter, sack it in response to make a 4/4, or just preemptively make a 4/4, and then you're getting 2 loyalty counters on the Tezzeret. You could then, during your turn, just use the Retrofit Foundry to make another token, and then -3 without killing it. So, again, obviously this isn't as high power level as it is in Historic, but I think these cards work well enough with Tezzeret specifically. They could be worth trying for sure. And then the last card from the set that I'm excited to try is Green Sun Zenith. Now, again, I'm not sure this has a great home immediately. Obviously there's Maverick-style decks, and I think Green Sun Zenith is obviously going to be at its best in creature-based combo decks, which, again, aren't really too many good ones in Timeless anyway. But I think if Strip Mine does get restricted, which I think is fairly likely, then I'm much more interested in Green Sun Zenith as a way to tutor for Raminak Excavator and White of the Reliquary, just cards that can tutor for your one-off Strip Mine and allow you to loop it. That could be an interesting home for it. I've seen some people say maybe you could run this in Primeval Titan decks as well, like Titanfield, but I mean, Titanfield has been kind of unplayable for a long time. Now with Strip Mine taking out Field of the Dead, that's going to become even worse. I think the main way you would want to accelerate into Primeval Titan was Sunken Citadel plus Castle Garenbrig, which doesn't, Green Sun Zenith doesn't enable. But again, you could maybe run Primeval Titan as a way to tutor for Strip Mine now, as opposed to Field of the Dead. But like I said, expensive cards are going to become a lot worse with Strip Mine as a 4-of in the format. So, I don't know. Zenith, unless there's a combo deck that I'm just forgetting about, probably feels like one that's worth looking back on once Strip Mine probably does get restricted. So that's my set review. Obviously, the set is pretty big, and the power level bar to clear to get playable in Timeless is pretty high. So I do think there's maybe a good chance that there are some cards that I've missed out on. So if there are any cards that you think I should have included that I didn't talk about, definitely let me know in the comments. There were quite a few that I thought about that I was like, this could be good, but the more I thought about it, realistically, I don't really think they're playable in Timeless. But if there are any, definitely let me know in the comments. I'd love to discuss those sorts of cards with you. Let me know what sort of decks you're planning to build once Timeless drops, because I do think there is a pretty big variety of stuff that you can try with these new cards. I'd be really interested to hear what you think. As I said, if you want to see some Theorycraft deck lists that I've put together built around these cards for Timeless, I'll have an MTG Zone Premium article down in the description. And for the Historic players, keep your eyes out over the next couple of days. If you're a premium member, there'll be an article going out tomorrow with Historic Theorycraft deck lists. And there'll also be another video coming out on Monday just before the set drop that's basically another video review like this, but for Historic, which is going to have obviously a lot more cards in, because there's a lot more cards that can see play in Historic. But like I said, I'm so excited for Timeless. These sorts of time periods where they just allow a new busted card to be legal as a 4-of for a while. I love that, because I always want to just find out the best version of the decks to enable that. And the metagame is hopefully going to change really quickly. So excited to try out Timeless once this drops. Although, having said that, I can see the metagame being pretty miserable with Force Strip Mine. But, we'll see. I've not played with the cards, so we'll have to see what it's like. But anyway, yeah, let me know in the comments what you think about Strip Mine being unrestricted. Let me know how long you think it'll be before it potentially gets a restriction. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. Catch you in the next one. Big up.